So we're currently in a Shemitah year, which is a sabbatical year in the land of Israel, which means the farmers don't work the fields according to the Torah. That was the parsha that we read about on Shabbat, the idea of there being a Shemitah year. And the Shemitah year is, there are a number of factors that go into it. It applies mostly in Israel, and as I wrote and mentioned over Shabbos, that there's definitely an element of Shemitah which transcends the border and is meant to relate to our relationship to Israel. But in particular, I want to talk about the agricultural piece of this, and in particular, the Heter Mechirah. Heter Mechirah is the mechanism used by many farmers in Israel, developed 120 years ago, over 120 years ago, to allow for agricultural endeavors to continue even on a year when that is forbidden by the Torah. So let's just take a look first at the headline, which can prompt a discussion, or that caught my attention in particular. And this is was in the Times of Israel, was on the JTA on April 23rd. Doron Toeg's farmyard is as quiet, peaceful, and unruffled as his voice. Apart from the occasional bleat from Gila and Simcha, two sheep kept by Tawi and his wife Alana, the farm is perfectly still. It's a far cry from the bustle that unfolded on a daily basis here prior to Rosh Hashanah holidays of years past, when the chatter of Thai farmhands competed with the rumble of idling tractors. The kind Tawi drove in TV ads for Strauss, one of Israel's largest food distributors, back when he's the company's exclusive eggplant supplier. That came to an end in 2014 when Tawi deliberately destroyed his entire eggplant crop. He injected their irrigation lines with poison in a dramatic effort to comply with the biblical commandment requiring Jews to let their fields lie fallow every 7 years. That was the end of his relationship with Strauss. Yet the sudden spiritual turn made Tawi, the third-generation farmer in central Israel, a guru for a growing movement of Orthodox Jews in Israel and beyond who want more farmers to eschew a loophole that has allowed Jews to continue working the land and making a profit from their crops during Shemitah years. Another Shemitah year began this Rosh Hashanah this past September. In its first 2 weeks, Tawi estimates 3,000 people came to the farm seeking blessings from him. The first was a man in full Haredi garb holding a crumpled piece of paper with a directive from Rabbi Chaim Kanievsky. One of the leading Haredi rabbis passed away a few months ago. The note instructed the man to seek out a blessing from a farmer who keeps Shemitah because there is no one more faithful. As the farmer's wife and the catalyst for her husband's faith, Alana Tawi has become an unwitting miracle worker, delivering hope for scores of people who arrived at her doorstep, begging her to intervene on their behalf and appeal to God to bless them with good health, a child, or a spouse. Every Friday evening, after lighting the Shabbat candles, Alana spends upwards of 2.5 hours reading the request she received. So we have a couple who, by the way, were not particularly Orthodox. They weren't fully observant, much more Masorati or traditional, which is typical in Israel. You don't really have, as I like to say, it's only in Israel where the secular Jew thinks that the secular Jew is secular, right? It's only the secular Israeli who thinks that a secular Israeli is secular. They're much more traditional, but these are not Orthodox or they're not religious Zionists or Haredi farmers by any stretch of the imagination, and still are not. But it lays out the Heter Mechirah concept, as well as a growing movement to not utilize the Heter Mechirah. And so, first, it is interesting that the spiritual journey of this couple, who are not Orthodox, how they went in this direction. As farmers, they felt a unique connection to the land and to being in Israel, and it was certainly something that inspired them to take this path, which others have, and a growing number of farmers are, while the overwhelming majority of farmers are not. But what's going on with this Heter Mechirah? What is? How did it come about? And what are some of the issues that are involved in whether or not it is functional or operable or permissible? And how is it being received today? Well, this article presents one way that's being received today, that people are rebelling against it or voting by closing their farms. And there is a movement the article mentions. You can take a look at the article online. A Keren Hashvi, an organization that helps farmers support themselves, doesn't replace their income, but does provide them with some support and assistance in ensuring that taking this year off from farming won't be detrimental to the future. Look, as I wrote on Friday, that Shemitah is a test of faith. And on one level, God says, don't work and it will be okay. Right? That's not usually how we handle things. Usually, we get worried about this, and we're supposed to take our hishtadlus. We're supposed to make our efforts to take care of things. But here, don't worry, it's going to be okay. So that is the Shemitah, and just it's important to note that there are a lot of twists in terms and rules and regulations relating to Shemitah. What about things that grow on their own? Things that grow, what is their status in terms of maintaining the sanctity of Shemitah? Right, the seventh year, the fruits of the land of Israel have all sorts of rules that apply to them relating to tithing and relating to other types of holiness. There's something called Kiddushat Shvi'it, the sanctity of the produce of the seventh year. Anyone who is visiting Israel, been to Israel, knows that this is a major issue with regards to where people will feel comfortable eating or how you dispose of your leftovers, because the produce has additional holiness in this year. So as well as if people buy Israeli wine that is bottled this year, or what's going to happen with our esrog this coming Sukkot, how that's going to play out. So there are ramifications and reverberations outside of those who farm and even outside of Israel. Lots of technical rules as well, but we're going to take the path of the Heter Mechirah, how it came about. So we know from already in the prophets that Shemitah was a complicated mitzvah, right? The prophets at the end of the First Temple period describe one of the shortcomings of the Jewish people were that they were not observing Shemitah. The others included the fact that there was idolatry and murder and hatred. There are all sorts of sins, but Shemitah has long been complicated. But for a long time, it wasn't really so relevant because from the time of the destruction of the Second Temple, there was not much Jewish farming taking place in the land. For the most part, Jewish settlement in the land was small places. There was pockets of Jews in places like Jerusalem, Hebron in the north, Tveria, Tzfat, that area, and they were not farmers. They were Jews. They were rabbis, and they were Jews essentially being supported from outside of Israel. There was no large mechanisms for support. Things started to change a little bit in the late 19th century when there was a more idealistic effort to move to Israel, both religious and non-religious Jews. This is kind of the pre-Zionism, the lovers of Zion who started to develop some of the places that would have farming. This is when those of us who follow the history of the land of Israel pre-1948. This is the period when the swamps started to be drained and people started to develop farms. And there were more often it was from the secular community, but there were religious Jews also who were involved in this. And all of a sudden, you start encountering the Shemitah as something that is relevant. So, for example, some of the early support from Israel from the philanthropists, the Rothschild family, you had Sir Moses Montefiore, they were actually related, and they were supporting efforts, right? The most famous effort is that windmill outside of Jerusalem when they started having settlement outside the old city walls. But they were also supporting agricultural endeavors, and so the agricultural endeavors were being financed by philanthropists and worked by Jews, and some of them were religious Jews, and they were being assisted by experts. In particular, Rothschild sent them from France, and it started to come up in the 1880s. That was the first time that the Jews said, well, we can't farm next year because it's a Shemitah year, and it became a major challenge because the French advisors didn't know about Shemitah, and they're like, well, we don't have anybody to work the fields, and that didn't really reflect well on those who were working, and that didn't really make the financial backers, philanthropists, very happy. And so that led to a little bit of a tension, which started to lead to, can we find a solution to allow the land to be worked? What are the options? What are the ways we can solve this? And so it's not the first time in Jewish history that tried to find a solution to circumvent a prohibition was undertaken. Right? There's a very famous one that we all engage in, selling our chametz on Pesach, and that also started off as a more specific act, so that people who had large supplies of chametz would be able to not own them on Pesach. But it goes earlier than that. The Talmud itself mentions examples of circumventing, having to deal with the difficulty of certain laws. And in particular, what we're talking about here is that the Shemitah year, you're not allowed to work the land. The land is holy. So one of the things that you can try and do, sell the land, right? To avoid there being that problem of a Jew having an issue working the land. And the Talmud in Mechirah, from the word Bechor, firstborn, tells a story of source number 2, Rav Mari bar Rachel had a certain flock of animals. He would transfer ownership of the ears of the firstborn fetuses to a Gentile in order to exempt them from the obligations of the firstborn status. Right? There's a rule. Also, it's we talk about Pidyon Haben. Well, the Bechor Behema, the firstborn of the animal, also had to be given for sanctified purposes, had to be given to the Kohen. So he wanted to avoid this, so he transferred the ownership to a non-Jew. So therefore, the firstborn is a non-Jewish owned animal, and therefore doesn't have to be given to the Kohen. In Rav Mari's case, he still prohibited it from being sheared and used for labor, and he still gave them to the Kohanim. And then the Talmud makes mention of the fact that his animals died, and one of the suggestions for them dying was that because he abrogated their sanctity by selling their ears, by removing them from his ownership and giving them to non-Jew. So Rav Mari did this. He implemented this. There seems to be the fact that his animals died, which is a suggestion that it was a punishment. But again, that downturn notwithstanding, he did it. He implemented this as a halachic solution of removing something from his property, giving it to a non-Jew, to avoid being subject to the laws of the firstborn animal. So this is something that exists. Again, leaving aside again the commentaries, was it a good thing or a bad thing? Was he punished for it? He did it. That's the whether you want to call this the rabbinic accommodation, the rabbinic loophole. The fact exists that we have mechanisms within Jewish law that help us overcome certain challenges or difficulties by not necessarily engaging in following the law. For example, selling the chametz is, we're not really, there's no halachic shortcut. And by that, I mean, we're not avoiding something halachic by selling the chametz, we're just removing it from our property. Here, there's a mitzvah upon Rav Mari to give the firstborn animal to the Kohen, and he's doing something to absolve himself from that. That has a much more direct parallel with Shemitah, in which we're avoiding that problem by turning things over to the non-Jew, and is there a way for us to still engage in farming? So when they talk about the Heter Mechirah, very often this Gemara in Bechorot is invoked because Rav Mari felt it was okay to step away from the religious obligations that would emerge because of the Bechor. So here too, there's a Shemitah year. There's a Shemitah year, but we can't handle that Shemitah year. Certainly in the 1880s and those early projects, abandoning the Shemitah year was not an option. So let's remove ourselves from being bound by the Shemitah rules, and let's sell the land to a non-Jew. Let's remove ourselves from the responsibility. Let's follow Rav Mari's approach. And in fact, in 1888, they appealed to different rabbis. And in Israel at the time were mostly, the Ashkenazic authorities were more strict. The Sephardic authorities were more lenient. They consulted with rabbis in Europe as well. Those who were further removed, who weren't really on the ground and were presented with a situation, felt that, look, this is a great need, right? It's not necessarily pikuach nefesh. Maybe sometimes we're thinking, you have to farm to save their lives. Unclear if that's absolutely true. There's non-Jews who are farming. There's obviously let the non-Jews own the land might be an option, but that was in 1888. It was determined. Okay, let's have this Heter Mechirah. Similar, we'll remove the land from Jewish ownership, and the land can still be farmed. There might still be sanctity attached to the produce, but this is how we're going to begin to get things started. Just before we go into some of the other halachic issues and obstacles, questions, comments on the concept or how we get to this point. Okay, so it was introduced, it was on the books, it was being utilized. We're talking about a very small, a very small test ground, but there aren't that many farmers or the like. And so, as we get started, the Heter Mechirah of 1888, was a fairly straightforward matter. The question is, once you do it once and you have another 7 years for this to be absorbed, lots of holes are being poked and lots of challenges are being raised, even though it's not so widespread. Al achas kama v'kama, how much more so as you take things further today. We've had 120 years to deal with this. So here are some of the holes that are poked in the Heter Mechirah. So the first has to do with, can we really sell parts of the land to non-Jews? Right, leaving aside the political land for peace discussion, which I think some of the feelings on some of those sides may revolve around this as well. The Torah mentions, source number 3 in Devarim, Hashem will give you the land, and you'll defeat your enemies. You should completely destroy them. Grant them no terms and give them no quarter. Sechanem from the Hebrew chen, which means favor. Interesting that chen means favor, and chinam. Well, chinam actually kind of means free, so because that is a favor. But anyway, lo sechanam, give them no quarter. Basically, don't you have to. The land is yours. Take charge. No treaties, no negotiation. Sounds almost like the Arab League after 67, right? We're not supposed to involve ourselves. We're supposed to. The land is ours. Hashem gave it to us. And the Talmud, in fact, says that lo sechanem involved 3 prohibitions. Source number 4, Avodah Zarah 28. You should not show them mercy. Teaches that you should not give them a chance to encamp in the land of Eretz Yisrael. Another matter, you should not show them mercy. This indicates that you should not give them favor. Another matter, this teaches you should not give them an undeserved gift. Right? This has a lot. Basically, this is keeping a distance between us and the non-Jew in general, but in particular in the land of Israel. So, how would we like to say there's a Heter Mechirah to sell the land if you're not allowed to sell the land? Seems pretty clear, and that was definitely one of the objections. So, to obviate the objection. One situation, some people invoke the Rambam. Well, the Rambam is describing this prohibition, source number 5, says it's forbidden to sell them fruit on the trees or grain on the stalk, but he may sell it after it be harvested or sell it on condition that he harvest it. And when he does harvest it, the purchase is binding. All right, all of these things to distance ourselves from giving things over to the non-Jews. Wherefore is it forbidden to sell to them? When is this applicable? Because it said, now show mercy unto them. That's our verse. Give them no permanency on land, for by having no land, their settlement will be but a temporary one. And so the Rambam mentions the prohibition and says he actually explains the prohibition. He says it's because we want them to only have a temporary settlement. And some of the commentaries jump on this statement of the Rambam, who normally doesn't give explanation, by saying, wait a second, we're not allowed to sell it permanently, right? But we only want their settlement to be a temporary one. Well, this Heter Mechirah has very specific terms. It's very temporary in the first place. So the Rambam doesn't say explicitly that you can sell parts of the land of Israel temporarily, but he says the prohibition against selling the land is for a reason, and that reason is so that the non-Jew not have permanent footholds in the land. Well, if that's the Rambam gives a reason here, and he doesn't usually give a reason for his prohibitions, we can say that the Rambam would be okay with selling the land temporarily. In fact, it seems that the Ramban, Nachmanides, says this explicitly. Sefer HaChinuch, source number 6, quotes the Ramban, who explains a different matter with regards to Lo Techanem. Prohibits us not to put the land in the hand of the Gentile in perpetuity. We do not sell it to them in perpetuity. He explained the verse like this: you shall not sell it to one who will hold it forever. That's a Gentile, but an Israelite will return. If you stipulate with a Gentile to return it, it is permitted to sell it to him. So we have the Heter Mechirah, which is we sell the land to a non-Jew. Well, you can't sell the land to a non-Jew. We have the Rambam potentially and the Ramban explicitly allowing it to be sold temporarily, and therefore we have a way of selling the land. So again, there are those who will disagree. They will say the Rambam doesn't say that you can sell it temporarily explicitly, and we disagree with the Ramban. You know, that's the nature of halachic discussion, halachic disputation. So, you know, that was one element of opposition. A second element of opposition has to do with regards to you know, what happens when what does non-Jewish ownership do? Does non-Jewish ownership even remove the religious obligation of the land? Right? You could say, you know, it's kind of like chametz. Chametz is chametz. We're just transferring it to the person, a different person. Well, the land is the land. Even if you sold the land, Shemitah should still apply. Maybe you're not allowed to have anything work the land from Shemitah. Maybe all of the same rules still apply. Just because it's not yours doesn't mean that gives you any specific allowances to use the land. So that's the next issue that's dealt with, and that is addressed with regards to the Shulchan Aruch, source number 7. Nowadays, even in a place where Jews ascending from the diaspora have acquired a presumption of ownership, and even in the days of Ezra, there is no Torah obligation of priestly gifts and tithes. Rather, rabbinic obligation exists, since the verse says, when you shall come, implying that all of you will send to the land, and not a partial aliyah as there was in the days of Ezra. And there are dissenters, and their position is that even nowadays we're biblically obligated in the land of Israel, yet we do not follow this custom. Basically, what's the status of the land of Israel today? Is it the exact same, that all the rules are as operative as they were then? Or have things changed, right? The Jews came to Israel in the times of Joshua. There was a first temple that was destroyed. They came back, the temple was destroyed. So the Talmud, and then later the Rambam in particular, understands things as, of course, the land is always holy, but it's different. The way the Jews conquered the land for the second time. When the Jews entered the land of Israel the first time, that was God said, the land is yours, you will take possession of it. Well, they took possession of it, and they lost possession of it. What about the second time when they came in? Well, the time of when they started coming back in the times of Ezra, their possession of the land was not as secure or as strong or as permanent as it was the first time. You know, for those who are familiar with the history, the Second Temple, early Second Temple period was only the small minority of the Jews who came back, and it was a tenuous hold. And the Jews were always under the control of other nations, right? They're under the control of the Persians, and then the Greeks, and then there was the Hanukkah story where the Hasmoneans actually had some level of independence for a short period of time before the Romans came in. So there's a different hold on the land at this time, and that's what the Shulchan Aruch is describing. That our hold on the land, with regard to the obligation of all of the rules of the land, is not the same. It's not a Torah obligation; it's a rabbinic obligation. The Ratzah says that there is no Torah obligation of priestly gifts, tithes. Rather, it's a rabbinic obligation. And the Ramah says some disagree, but we follow this, and it's a rabbinic obligation. If this is a rabbinic obligation, well, then maybe that changes the whole status of all of the requirements. Again, we listen to the rabbis, we follow rabbinic rules, but maybe there's more room for flexibility if this is all rabbinic. The Vilna Gaon, who is a major figure in Jewish law, endorses this view in source number 8, where he actually says that we're allowed to sell land to non-Jews. Yesh kinyan lo'oved kochavim be'eretz Yisrael, kiven shehu midrabanan k'mo shekosafti. The land, the holiness of the land is different. When we sell it to a non-Jew today, it is okay, and so he endorses the fact that things have changed in Israel today. If that's the case, if the responsibilities are no longer Torah obligations, then maybe there's room to allow you can sell the land to the non-Jew and you can work the land, because the level of obligation for these rules is only rabbinic. You should follow it, and you should keep Shemitah as much as possible. But in terms of the produce is still holy, but you're going to sell the land to the non-Jew. And this too opens up the possibility of, okay, let's sell the land, and everything that is produced from the land will still be holy, and we'll still treat it properly as per the rabbinic obligation. But since there's no Torah obligation, we're able to sell the land to the non-Jew and keep it open during Shemitah. Again, the Ramah himself mentions there are those who disagree. The Ramah says we don't care about those who disagree, but the Ramah is not the final word on this issue. There were those who feel, no, we don't follow this view. We follow the view of those who feel who are of the opinion that the land is still holy and everything is still in force biblically. If that's the case, then you can't do anything. So again, the Heter Mechirah is a pendulum. You have the more permissive side, you have the more restrictive side. You have the permissive, then you also have the permissive side, which seems to be encouraging it when there's a great need. What happens when the need gets a little bit less? Right? What happens when it's not just a couple of farms, as the entire agricultural situation is, you have many more opportunities. Does that mean it's the Heter Mechirah is weaker or the Heter Mechirah is stronger? Let's just stop. If there are any questions or need for clarifications on anything, we'll stop now for a minute before going on. It's also helpful to note that, a question that I don't know if anyone is thinking, but it's probably very fundamental to this. How do we know that this year is a Shemitah year? Other than me telling you, or the Luach telling us. And so this also enters a whole discussion in terms of, how certain are we this is a Shemitah year? In fact, there's a whole connection between Shemitah, the sabbatical year, and Yovel, the Jubilee year. And there's even a machlokas as to how you count the Jubilee years. For example, if you count from year 1, so year number 7 is Shemitah. Then you start counting year number 1 again. Then you get to year 49, it's Shemitah. Year 50 is Jubilee. Okay, but is year 50 also year 1 for the next Shemitah cycle, the next sabbatical cycle, or is there an off year? And so is it 49, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, or 49, 50, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7? And so how does that play out? And there's a machlokas, and how do we follow? Especially now, we don't have Yovel. Yovel, everyone agrees that Yovel is no longer applicable. So if we have no Yovel, what does that do to Shemitah? Is it possible that if you don't have Yovel, you don't have Shemitah at all? There might be a dispute as to what year we're counting. If you don't have Yovel, does it still go into the count? So there is a machlokas, and this year may not be the Shemitah year, and that's how it's always been. So there's always been a machlokas, and the view that is followed, the one that we follow, says that is a Shemitah year. But we also have that mitigation as well to focus on. That colors the whole discussion. So for those who are looking for another leg to hold on to with regards to the Heter Mechirah, so let's just to review. You have the fact you're not supposed to sell land to the non-Jew. Well, maybe it's only temporary. You're not. So what about the holiness of the land? Well, I guess maybe the holiness of the land these days has been abrogated. It's only rabbinic our obligation to keep things. So if it's rabbinic, there's more room for mitigation. 3, when the whole backdrop for all of this is based on something which may be the subject of dispute, which also allows for some room for leniency. Rambam Kesef Mishnah, source number 9 and 10. Kesef Mishnah's Rabbi Yosef Karo develops the idea from the Rambam, where he talks about you're not allowed to sell the land to a non-Jew, but he mentions the idea what happens when a Jew subsequently repurchases the land from a non-Jew. Like what happens if the non-Jew takes hold of the land anyway? So Rabbi Yosef Karo Kesef Mishnah says, well, this sounds like, right, if the non-Jew takes the land, then there's no obligation for the follow the rules of the land. And when the Jew takes it back, then the following of the rules resumes. So all of a sudden you have this idea of maybe a precedent, right? The non-Jew has the ownership, then the Jew can get it back. Maybe we will then excuse following the rules of the land for that period of time. Others would say, well, that's fine, but here the Jew is selling it in the first place. That's not the right way of behaving. So there's always going to be point counterpoint. The Torah and source number 11 points out something, that the whole idea that we're saying of Shemitah, it's only midrabanan. If Shemitah nowadays is only rabbinic, based on everything that we've said, also including the calendar, well, then maybe there's also room for mitigation. Some would say, well, we don't follow the Torah, right? It continues to go back and forth, and I think that on the one hand, you had the reality of farmers in Israel versus the fact that the Torah seems very strongly committed to Shemitah, and God says, I'll take care of you. So is it that we follow the reality or we follow that God will take care of us, right? It kind of brings to mind the story of the guy who's facing the oncoming floodwaters from the hurricane, and they try to evacuate him, and they send the boat and they send the helicopter, and he dies and gets up to heaven and says, God, I was waiting for you. And God says, I sent you the boat and the helicopter and everything, right? So it's kind of, what is the worldview? What's the mentality here? With regards to approaching this Heter Mechirah. And I think it's really, in addition to the halachic point, counterpoint, we also have a worldview different worldviews that are being implemented. So for example, source number 12, this is Rabbi Avram Yitzchak Kook, who wrote a book about Shemitah Shabbat Haaretz, as when he became more active on the rabbinic scene, right? We said the first Heter Mechirah was 1888. So then you move 7 years on and further. So Rav Kook ultimately was in Israel in the beginning of the 20th century. And that, as chief rabbi, he was consulted. And so he wrote in favor of the Heter Mechirah. And so Rav Kook, Rav Kook, when it first started, he was only 24 years old in 1888. But he was active in Shemitahs later on, and he was in Israel for Shemitah of 1909, Shemitah of 1916, 23, 30, right? This is where Rav Kook is active on the scene. So what did he write? Well, what's his take on Heter Mechirah? So look at source number 12. There is no basis for questioning this approach as an emergency measure with public losses involved, even if the advancement of Jewish settlement in Eretz Yisrael were not the issue. How much more so is this valid when the very basis of Jewish existence in Israel is at stake? But no permanent ruling has been laid down, only a temporary one. Whenever it becomes clear to an authoritative Beit Din that there is no alternative, let it implement its decision in the name of heaven. So Rav Kook feels that when there's a critical public loss involved, it's okay. And certainly when it's talking about building the land of Israel. At the same time, he's not embracing this as a lichatchila. He doesn't see this as an ideal. He sees this as a necessary measure. And so some people invoke that first sentiment expressed by Rav Kook. It's for the good of the country, it's for the good of the land, it's for the good of the people, it's to avoid loss. It halachically works, let's do it forever. And some say, no, that worked back then, and now things have changed. Others say things have changed even more so now. When agriculture was a small scattering of farms, it was one thing. Now you have such a huge agricultural system in Israel, it becomes harder to remove the Heter Mechirah. But for Rav Kook, it was about what's needed for the people. Source number 13, Yeshua Malko, responsible from that period of time. Regarding Shemitah, I am baffled. For selling the lands is clearly permissible, especially since the Sephardic luminaries whose fingernails are wider than the stomachs of the Ashkenazi luminaries. That's a rabbinic term of saying they're smarter than we are. Permit non-Jews to work the land during Shvi. How can we consider their Torah meaningless? So this was an approach that was taken, as we said at the beginning. When the issue came up in Israel, it was the Sephardic rabbis who took the bull by the horns. The Ashkenazic rabbis were more hesitant to opine and to permit. And this is, I would say, a characteristic of the Sephardic community in general, that their rabbis have always taken a very practical approach as to the needs of the people. And they look very specifically at halachically, is it okay or is it not okay? I think a parallel issue to this emerged back in April 2020, in the early weeks of COVID, when everything was moving to Zoom. And at first the question was about Zoom and reading Megillah. And then people were asking, what about a Zoom Seder? Especially as people were isolating and there would be terrible loneliness, and how would that work? So for the most part, I think across the board, there was, in the halachic community, in the Orthodox traditional world, no, you can't use Zoom on Yom Tov. You can't use Zoom on Shabbos, can't use Zoom on Yom Tov. And there was a view that came out of Israel of a Moroccan rabbinic authority who had permitted it. And like all hell breaks loose, because here's an Orthodox rabbi with a long white beard saying that you're allowed to use Zoom on Yom Tov. And as the issue got more attention and the explanation came out, it really was consistent with how the Moroccan Jews in general had understood electricity when it comes to Yom Tov. Right, we know that for the most part, people have very similar approaches to electricity on Shabbos and Yom Tov. If you don't turn it on, you don't turn it off. It's muktzah, we call it, because you can't touch it. You stay away from it. You don't utilize it. But when it comes to Yom Tov, it's not so clear that the turn of the 20th century, when electricity was first introduced widely and was being studied, there were those who felt that electricity can be utilized on Yom Tov. You're allowed to turn lights on, because just like you're allowed to light a candle. You're not allowed to light from, if you're allowed to light a candle from an existing flame. Turning on the electricity, the energy is there. You're just releasing it. It's kind of lighting a candle from an existing flame. You're turning on the electricity from the existing current, and that was deemed as acceptable. Now, over time, other issues and challenges were introduced, and the more common view today is not to use electricity even on Yom Tov. But this rabbi in the Moroccan community was sticking with the approach that you can use electricity. And so if you have it on, and there's nothing wrong with being in front of your Zoom and someone else being in front of the Zoom, it's on, you can't turn it off. But and in particular, recognizing the values and the approach of the community, their approach to electricity, the approach of the Seder, the role of the Seder in the community, they went with it. So I think that similarly, when it came to the Heter Mechirah, that's why early on it was the Sephardic authorities who saw it as acceptable. Let's look to the sources. The sources permit it, right? It's different. It's new. It hasn't been done before. That doesn't matter. We follow what the direction that the sources lead us. And I think that's what source number 13, the Yeshua Smalko, is noting, that it was the Sephardic authorities who took much more broader responsibility for this and just went with it, including the fact that some of the Ashkenazic rabbis begged off from issuing an answer and turned people towards the Sephardic authorities. That's what he's referring to. So let's look to let's go to the videotape. Let's go to what halacha tells us. Halacha allows us room to allow this, then it's allowed. So you have Rav Kook, who wishes it could be differently, but recognizes the validity. That view, has led to the fact that nowadays people feel that if there are ways to avoid the Heter Mechirah, then avoid it, like the farmer in our article. You have those, Yeshua Smalko, it's allowed, and let's not move away from it. And then you had a very restrictive view. Rabbi Yaakov David Widlowski was a rabbi in Tzfat. He was a well-known rabbi at the turn of the 20th century. He actually had come to America. A very anti-modern approach to all things Jewish. And what he said about the Shemitah is, think about it. If the Rav of Yafa writes on a piece of paper a bill of sale to a barefoot Arab that all the land in Eretz Yisrael that is owned by Jews is owned by the Arab, does this mean that the Arab actually owns the land and thereby removes the sanctity from the land? The bill of sale is worthless except for use as a bottle cap. All right. I think we get where I think we understand his view. There's no equivocation there. It's a joke. He's not owning the land. If he's not owning the land, the sanctity doesn't move away. This is way too big a deal for this to be, handled the way we handle chametz. We can study Rav Wilowski's approach to chametz separately, and many will say that we've taken too many liberties with that as well. But here you have, he's like, don't even go down this path. He definitely disagrees with it on halachic terms, and he certainly disagrees with it on philosophical world outlook terms. Torah says to keep Shemitah, we're going to keep Shemitah. The rest is commentary. We're done. And so you've had these various approaches percolating for 120 years now, and more. And so many will say that once the Heter to sell was introduced, we've now it's become really the commonly accepted practice. Once it's the commonly accepted practice, that strengthens its legitimacy, and we should never back away from it. If you want to be strict, back away from it. But but this exists. The fruit still has sanctity. You have to be careful with it. But this is, for example, Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, a great posek in Israel, Rabbi Moshe Feinstein in America. Neither of them are embracing this full-throatedly, but they recognize that the Heter Mechirah is something that's valid and is out there. Interestingly, Rabbi Joseph Soloveitchik took more of a hardline approach and was not in favor of the Heter Mechirah. He felt it was a bit of a radical leniency that, had it maybe out of necessity, could be invoked, but for the most part should not. Again, he's living in America, so it maybe might be less relevant and pressing for him. But because of that approach, for example, all the kashrus organizations in America don't rely on the Heter Mechirah when it comes to any products that come in from Israel. The idea that it's almost a Rav Kook approach being implemented, the fact that what's done is done, but we shouldn't really be encouraging it. And just interesting that has that view has taken root and taken hold of, I would say, many of the rabbis in the Orthodox community today, the non-Orthodox community here today. And from a kashrus perspective, it's good policy and good business to keep that view so as to be as palatable and acceptable to as many as possible. In Israel, it remains the Heter Mechirah remains the strongest worldview. The idea that it was introduced on a halachic basis, it was endorsed at the time by significant rabbinic authorities. Even those who disagreed many who disagreed never said it was completely forbidden. Those who said it was forbidden were really living in the world of farming in Israel. And so it's really only been in recent years, like our farmer only started keeping Shemitah in 2014 as the infrastructure started to emerge to allow for an amplification of the voice that was against the Heter Mechirah, as well as creating ways of assisting those farmers who will keep Heter Mechirah. Right? This organization, the Karen Hashvius, their budget went from $27 million to $67 million since the last Shemitah. It's only a fraction of a multi-billion-dollar industry. So we're not really at a point that that the marketplace or the farms are going to be able to accept Shemitah, Heter Mechirah significantly. And certainly within the religious Zionist community, where that has been most active and influential in setting the tone amongst the builders of the land and the farmers, even the non-religious ones. The Rabbi Ari Khan is quoted in the article, last source 15. Proponents of Heter Mechirah within Israel's national religious bloc, what Americans might refer to as modern Orthodox, regard the 125-year-old loophole not only as legitimate but optimal. They think that preserving Israel's agricultural solvency, as well as the livelihoods of individual farmers, is of paramount importance. And relying on foreign-grown produce or that grown by non-Jews is antithetical to many religious Zionism's central tenets. Rabbi Ari Khan, a senior lecturer in Jewish studies at Bar Ilan University, argues that modern-day realities can and should trump other considerations, including the most stringent interpretations of Jewish law. The response to what is ideal depends on the reality you're dealing with. If you're dealing with a fantasy about the Messianic age, then the response would be one thing. If you're dealing with the modern state of Israel with a large percentage of non-religious and non-Jewish people, then the ideal is Heter Mechirah. And I think that's definitely a very widely held view in the broader religious Zionist community in Israel. And many, even if they disagree with it being an ideal, recognize that it has a foundation upon which to rely upon. And that is with regards to the Heter Mechirah today.